Eckhart Tolle. Stop explaining yourself to people living in illusions. Let go of defining who you are to yourself or to anyone else. You won't disappear. You'll actually come to life. This is one of Eckhart Tolle's most empowering lessons, and it directly challenges everything the ego thinks it needs to survive. The ego is absolutely convinced that if you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your stance, stop justifying every single choice you make, you'll somehow just vanish. But the opposite is true. The moment you stop over-explaining, that's the moment you really start to live. Recent research from 2024 and 2025 just backs up what Tolle has been saying for decades. Self-justification is just an unconscious defense mechanism of the ego. When you feel this compulsive need to explain yourself, you're not communicating honestly. You're just trying to protect a fake identity that doesn't need defending in the first place. Let's be blunt. Most people demanding explanations from you are trapped in their own false beliefs. And when you try to explain yourself to someone stuck in that kind of illusion, you're not actually making anything clearer. You're just stepping into their dream and pretending it's real. Tolle teaches that whenever you get defensive about something, you've become identified with an illusion. Really pay attention to that. It's not that the facts you're standing up for are necessarily wrong. It's that you've connected your sense of self to a particular belief. And now the ego is treating that belief as if it is you. The instant you think, I need them to get it, or they have to see things from my side, you've already lost that sense of being present. Because presence doesn't take sides. Presence has no position it needs to defend. Why you can't explain yourself to people in ego illusion. Here's what happens when you try to explain yourself to people who are unconscious. They filter everything you say through their own ego. They aren't really listening to you. They're only hearing how your words either support or threaten their own beliefs. Tolle explains that at the heart of all ego activity are repetitive thoughts, emotions, and automatic reactions that you strongly identify with. This is the ego itself, a pattern of beliefs that creates your sense of I. When someone is identified with their ego, they're not truly hearing what you're saying. Unconsciously, they're asking themselves, does this support my way of thinking, or does it challenge it? If your explanation aligns with their views, they'll agree with you, not because it's the truth, but because it makes them feel correct. But if your explanation challenges their beliefs, they'll reject it, not because it's wrong, but because their ego feels threatened by the challenge. Research from 2024 and 2025 about defense mechanisms just reinforces this pattern. Self-justification is defined as how we rationalize our actions and beliefs to feel good about ourselves. When people face information that goes against how they see themselves, they feel cognitive dissonance, a kind of mental discomfort, and they automatically kick into defense mode. These defenses include things like denial, projection, and rationalization. They all twist reality to protect the ego's structure. So, when you explain yourself to someone whose ego feels attacked by what you're saying, you're not giving them information they can use. You're triggering their defenses. Your explanation just becomes more ammunition they'll use to protect their own view. Tolle warns, you can't give someone presence just by explaining things. Presence can only awaken presence, but only if they're already open to it. If someone is completely wrapped up in their ego, your explanations will only make them more unconscious. That's why awakened people eventually stop trying to explain themselves to everyone. They realize it's pointless to try and communicate truth to minds that are so busy defending their egos. The energy cost of constant explaining. Here's what Tolle understands and what recent research confirms. Constantly explaining yourself drains an enormous amount of the energy you need to stay present. When you get caught up in defensively explaining, trying to get unconscious people to understand your choices, defending your boundaries, justifying your decisions, you activate the same reactive patterns that spiritual awakening is meant to dissolve. Studies from 2025 show that these immature defense mechanisms, like self-justification, are linked to anxiety, depression, and even personality disorders. People who constantly feel the need to explain and defend themselves show much higher levels of stress. The ego believes it needs others' approval to survive, so it compulsively explains, justifies, defends, wasting energy that could be used for presence, creativity, or real connection. Tolle teaches that as you become more aware, you start to notice these dysfunctional patterns. You see the sudden urge to explain yourself rising up, and then you have a huge choice. Do you give in to the pattern and act it out? Or do you let it meet the light of your presence and fade away? Most people never make this choice consciously, because they are the pattern. There's no awareness watching the urge to explain. There's just automatic explaining, justified by this belief that they need to understand. But watch what happens when you stop feeding this pattern. At first, it might be uncomfortable. The ego will create anxiety. If you don't explain, they'll misunderstand you. They'll think you're wrong. They'll judge you. And then comes the liberating realization: let them. When you stop needing others to understand you, something amazing happens. You actually become more available for genuine connection. Because now you're not putting on a show for validation. You're not trying to manage how other people see you. You're just present. The people who resonate with your true self will understand you without long explanations. And the people who don't will never understand you, no matter how much you explain. Tolle puts it simply: don't worry about how other people define you. When they define you, they're limiting themselves, so it's their problem. This isn't arrogance. This is recognizing that other people's views exist in their minds, not yours. Their definitions are their mental constructs. When you try to control those constructs by explaining, you're trying to do the impossible, trying to manage what's going on inside someone else's head. The awakened response is to let people think whatever they think, not because you don't care, but because you realize that their thoughts about you are not actually about you. They're about the story they're telling themselves. How the ego uses explaining to maintain illusion. Here's the tricky trap Tolle wants you to see. The ego doesn't just explain to convince other people. It explains to convince itself. Every single time you verbally justify a choice or defend your position, you're strengthening your connection to that belief. You're telling yourself a story about who you are and why you're right. Eckhart Tolle teaches that the ego strengthens itself through this kind of mental rehearsal, reactive patterns and old emotions. They're all part of that stream of thinking, connected to the past, and explaining is how the ego keeps that stream flowing. Notice what happens. When you're prevented from explaining something you desperately want to justify. Frustration arises, right? Maybe even anger. The ego feels invalidated, unseen, misunderstood. That frustration, that's the signal. It reveals that you've identified with a belief, a mental position, so strongly that defending it feels like defending your life. But Tolle asks, who is defending what? When you're genuinely present, there's no position to defend. Consciousness simply perceives what is. Actions arise from presence, clear, appropriate, responsive to the moment, but there's no story running in the background about why those actions prove you're right and others are wrong. The ego, however, cannot function without these stories. It creates mental positions, then spends an enormous amount of energy defending them through explaining, justifying, and rationalizing. Research on self-justification from 2024-2025 identifies this exact pattern. People with highly developed justification narratives show measurably higher ego defensiveness. The constant explaining isn't clarifying their position. It's protecting their identity. This is why Tolle teaches to give up defining yourself, not just to others, but to yourself. Every time you tell yourself, "I'm the kind of person who," or "I did this because I'm," you're creating and defending an identity. The ego loves these definitions because they give it substance, but they're all mental constructs, stories about who you are, rather than direct presence with what you actually are. What presence does instead of explaining. So, if awakened presence doesn't explain itself, what does it do? Tolle's answer is radical in its simplicity. It acts from awareness and allows the action to speak. When you're genuinely present, your behavior emerges naturally from consciousness. You set a boundary, not because you need to prove you're right to have that boundary, but because presence recognizes what's appropriate in this moment. You make a choice, not because you can justify it and to everyone's satisfaction, but because awareness sees clearly what this situation requires. You walk away from toxic dynamics, not because you can explain why they're toxic, in terms the toxic person will accept, but because presence simply doesn't participate in unconsciousness. Here's the key: presence-based actions carry their own authority. They don't need verbal justification because they emerge from something deeper than mental positions. They emerge from direct perception of what is. When someone questions a choice you've made from presence, the awakened response isn't lengthy explanation. It might be simple acknowledgement. "I understand this doesn't make sense to you," or even just silence, allowing the other person their reaction without trying to manage it. This takes enormous trust. The ego wants to control how others perceive you. Presence recognizes that control is impossible and unnecessary. Tolle explains that when you interact with people, you should be there as a field of conscious presence rather than primarily as a function or role. This means your primary identity isn't person who must be understood. It's simply awareness itself. From that space, explaining happens when it genuinely serves communication, not when it serves ego defense. The difference is palpable. Ego-based explaining feels compulsive, urgent, defensive. There's tension in the body, contraction in the breath. You keep talking, elaborating, adding more reasons, because none of it actually satisfies the ego's need for validation. Presence-based communication feels spacious, clear, complete. You say what awareness perceives is helpful, then you stop. Whether the other person understands or agrees becomes irrelevant, because you're not identified with their understanding when to speak and when to stay silent. Tolle offers practical guidance here. Notice the difference between sharing something because it might genuinely help someone in this specific moment versus sharing to establish your credentials or defend your position. The first comes from presence. The second comes from ego. Most explaining is the second type, disguised as the first. Watch for these signs. That explaining has become ego defense. You keep repeating yourself because they still don't get it. This reveals that you need them to get it, for your ego's sake, not for their benefit. You feel frustrated or angry that you have to explain. This shows you believe you shouldn't have to explain. Another ego position that wants reality to be different than it is. You're mentally rehearsing what you'll say while they're talking. This means you're not actually listening, you're defending. Your explanation keeps growing, longer and more elaborate. The ego believes that if you just find the right words, the perfect analogy, the irrefutable logic, then they'll have to understand. But understanding isn't the issue. Receptivity to consciousness is research from 2025 on cognitive biases shows that people don't change strongly held beliefs based on logical arguments. Instead, they experience the backfire effect. Contradictory evidence actually strengthens their original position. This is exactly what Tolle teaches about ego structure. The ego doesn't want truth. It wants confirmation. When you try to explain something that threatens the ego's mental position, you're not providing helpful information, you're attacking their sense of self. The awakened response recognizes this futility. You don't try to argue someone out of ego identification through explanation. You either wait for a genuine opening, a moment of receptivity, when consciousness recognizes consciousness, or you simply allow them their illusion. This doesn't mean you enable harm or stay silent about injustice. It means you distinguish between presence-based clear communication and ego-based defensive explaining. Presence might state a boundary, firmly. I'm not available for this kind of interaction. No explanation, no justification, just clear communication of what is. The ego would add, and here's why your behavior is unacceptable, and here are all the ways you're wrong, and here's the evidence that proves I'm right. See the difference? Presence communicates and stops. Ego communicates and then defends, justifies, explains, proves. The liberation of not explaining. Here's what Tolle promises, and people discover. When they actually stop explaining themselves, you don't die. You come to life. All that energy you were burning on defensive explaining becomes available for presence, for creativity, for genuine connection, for simply being here now. You'll find that the people who truly matter understand you without needing a novel-length explanation, and the people who don't understand, well, their lack of understanding doesn't diminish you because you're not clinging to their perception of you. Relationships, they become cleaner. No more exhausting cycles of explaining, defending, justifying. You simply state what's true for you. They either get it or they don't. Both outcomes are perfectly fine because you're not on a mission to convince anyone of anything. Now, the ego. It finds this terrifying. It's convinced that your very social survival depends on getting everyone else's approval, their understanding, their validation. So, giving up explaining. It feels like social death, like you're being cancelled. But as Eckhart Tolle teaches, and as awakened people will tell you, the opposite happens. When you stop performing for other people's understanding, you become more authentic. And that authenticity, it's like a magnet, attracting genuine connection while repelling the fake stuff. Those people who needed you to constantly explain yourself and justify your every move, they weren't actually connecting with you. They were connecting with some mental image, some idea they had of who they wanted you to be. When you stop feeding that image by endlessly explaining, they might just fade away. And that's not a loss, it's clarity. Meanwhile, the people who are actually capable of a real presence-to-presence connection, they'll recognize something different about you. You're no longer tied up in knots, defensive patterns. You're just here, available, authentic, clear. Recent research from 2024 on authentic relating shows that people who demonstrate lower defensiveness create relationships built on higher trust, deeper intimacy, and greater satisfaction. The study even found that defensiveness, including all that excessive explaining and justifying, creates actual barriers to genuine connection. Eckhart Tolle would tell you that this is because defensiveness is pure ego activity, and the ego can only create ego relationships. Presence, on the other hand, creates space for real meeting. The practice, catching the urge to explain. So, how do you actually put this teaching into practice? How do you stop yourself from explaining when the urge feels so automatic? Eckhart Tolle's advice: bring your awareness to the urge itself. Don't try to force yourself not to explain. Instead, notice when that impulse to explain starts bubbling up. Feel where it lives in your body. Usually there's some kind of tension, maybe in your throat, your chest, or even your stomach. That tension, that's the ego's desperate need to defend itself. Then ask yourself this: who needs this explanation? Is this presence the real you, communicating something genuinely helpful? Or is this just the ego trying to control how I'm perceived? Often, simply asking the question is enough. That awareness alone creates some space between you and the urge. The impulse might still be there, but you're not automatically acting on it. Sometimes, you'll end up speaking anyway, and that's okay. This isn't about perfection. It's about shining a light, bringing consciousness to patterns that were previously running on autopilot. Over time, Eckhart Tolle teaches that the gap, the time between that reactive urge and the return of your awareness, that gap gets shorter. Eventually, awareness is right there, present, when the impulse arises, and then you have a genuine choice. You might choose to explain when it truly serves clear communication, or you might choose silence, allowing the other person to have their reaction while you remain present. Both choices become available when you're no longer defined by this need to be understood. The ultimate teaching, Eckhart Tolle's teachings on not explaining yourself, it points to something much deeper than just communication strategy. It points to the most fundamental question of all, the question of identity. When you stop needing to explain yourself, you stop reinforcing the illusion, that false belief of this separate little self that needs constant defending. You begin to rest in presence itself, not as some identity that must be protected at all costs, but a simple, aware being. This is what Eckhart Tolle means when he says, you will come to life. You stop living as some rigid mental position, some belief that must be constantly explained and defended. You start living as consciousness itself, here, now, aware. The people still living in that ego illusion, they'll never understand this shift because they're completely identified with the very structure, the very illusion that you've now seen through. They might even call you cold, detached, uncommunicative, because from the ego's limited perspective, refusing to explain yourself looks like refusing to connect. But those people capable of presence, they recognize what's actually happened. You've stopped feeding unconscious patterns. You've become available for something real. And here's the paradox that Eckhart Tolle loves. When you stop trying so hard to be understood, you often become more deeply understood than ever before, but only by those capable of understanding beyond mental explanations, by those who can meet you in presence, where true understanding happens without any words. The rest, well, they can think whatever they want to think. You're finally free to simply be. Final practice. Today, pay attention. Notice, how many times do you find yourself explaining yourself when no explanation is actually needed? How often do you justify choices that don't even require justification? How much energy do you spend trying to manage, trying to control other people's perceptions? And then, notice. What happens when you stop? That's silence. It might feel uncomfortable at first. The ego will start generating anxiety, but underneath all that anxiety is something the ego has been desperately trying to cover up: your actual presence, which needs no explanation, because it simply is. Eckhart Tolle's promise is simple: give up defining yourself. You won't die. You'll come to life. Try it. Stop explaining yourself to people still trapped in illusions. They won't understand anyway. And it's not because you didn't explain it well enough. It's because true understanding requires a level of consciousness that they haven't yet accessed. Save your energy for presence. Save your words for genuine communication. And let the rest just go. When you stop defending who you think you are, you just might discover who you actually are. And that discovery, that doesn't need any explanation.